welcome to Nostalgia Alley, where we go down memory lane. And I went down memory lane recently. My lovely wife, the lovely Joan Delaloy, was in Lake George, New York, and my childhood was spent in Lake George, New York. From the age of 12 up to the age of 17, we take the 1950 Buick and we hightail it out of the city. We go to Lake George, New York. I went to visit her. We went to Bolton Landing, where I spent wonderful, wonderful times. Childhood memories were phenomenal. Used to stay at a place called Lamb's Lakeshore Cottages. Well, Lamb's Lakeshore Cottages, no more, multi-million-dollar condominiums. And it was very nostalgic walking where I used to walk when I was a kid. When I got back to New York, I said, I'd love to have a memory of Lake George, New York. I went on eBay, I typed out Lake George, New York, and I got a postcard. And believe it or not, it was a postcard from Lamb's Lakeshore Cottages. This is it. And via a postcard, I really had a wonderful piece of my childhood, my history. And that's what the show is about tonight. It's about postcards. And we have some fabulous gifts. We have Kathy Leventhal, who is a postcard collector and a member of the Maplewood Board. And she's been collecting for a fairly long time. It's a wonderful hobby. And we have John Harvey, wrote a book on postcards, all about the wonderful, wonderful history of Maplewood through the eyes of postcards. Phenomenal book. It's available locally at the Maplewood Bookstore. John, got to ask you, how did it all start? I understand it started in Hungary, of all places.
Postcards.
Postcards.
Yeah, 1869 in Hungary. And it was actually, there were wood cuttings that were used prior to that, mainly for art purposes. But they were transitioned to become smaller cards and more usable for the purpose of print. So they became postal cards in Hungary. There were a number of iterations of postcards in the late 1800s. They were used to advertise expositions. They were used for advertising. And they really took off here in the United States in the 1890s and became a form of communication. With telephones not available, people needed to communicate. And postcards or penny cards became the means of communicating, especially here in the U.S. And up until 1898, the cards were published by the federal government. And I have a card here, which is pre-1898, and you can see the front of the card has a tremendous amount of script on it. The person wrote their note here. And the reason was, at that time, on the back of the card, you could only put the address. You couldn't put any notes or any notations on the card itself. And then in 1898, there was a passage of a legislation that allowed the cards to be split on the back, and people could write both the address and a note. So that was really the early start of postcards as we know them today.
Well, and color postcards, when did they come about? When they added color, and how was that? It must have been an incredibly complicated process way back then to color a postcard.
Yeah, back in from 1898, when they were privately made, up until about the beginning of World War I, 1915, most of the postcards were made in Germany. And this is actually a postcard, a hand-painted card from that period. Probably around 1903, 1904, and you can see on the card it's the intersection of Valley Street and Jefferson Avenue, and you can see that the card is hand colored, and they were hand colored in Germany. Was made out of a linen type of card that held the ink, but most of those were produced in Germany. And with the start of World War I, obviously the relations between the U.S. and Germany were not they weren't marketing partners. It really stopped the production in Germany and started the slow decline of cards as a form of communication.
Well, what is a private mailing era? I know it was 1897 where the government gave permission, more or less, to privatize the card selling, or?
Exactly, both the production and the selling of the cards. And so you would find companies, for example, in Maplewood, one of the buildings, if you look at it, is Serlin Shops. Kathleen and I were talking about this earlier. And they actually produced their own cards, or had them produced, for the purpose of selling them in their store, because this was a form of stationery at the time. And if you read the messages, the statistics in the early 1900s, I think the average American wrote something like 150 postcards a year. And if you read some of the messages, you'd have, very mundane messages like, I'll be over your house on Friday at 4 for dinner,
Right.
to very emotional messages, people writing about even their terminally ill people writing about their next chapter when they pass on. So they were used for all different types of communication.
And when did the term postcards come into effect?
It was really in that late period of the 1890s when it really became, very popular as a formal means of postal communication.
Right. And the modern age of postcards, that was basically from 1960 to 1930, what was that exactly, the modern age? What did that entail?
It was post-World War I.
Right.
The cards were being produced here in the U.S. Admittedly, they were of lower quality than what you had found. The production capabilities in Germany from the early 1900s were absolutely incredible. So what the cards at that time were made out of was actually rags. They would take rags and make linen, produce linen out of it. And the cards were made out of a very low-grade linen. And that's how they were produced. And then towards the end of that period, the cards as we know them today, the Kodachrome cards, became popular, where they have the glossy front. And if you would go to Lake George, for example, and look at postcards, you would most likely find a Kodachrome card.
Now we have the computer, we have television and video and digital cameras. Are postcards as popular now as they were back in the 1900s or the 1920s or 30s?
As a form of communication, absolutely not. Okay, for collectors like Kathy and myself, I think it's an amazing peek at day-to-day life and history, both messages, and when you look at some of the cards and see some of the cars of the year or the trains that came through Maplewood, and some cards you'll see people just walking by 100 years ago. So I think from a collector's standpoint, they're incredibly valuable. What I found interesting, and when I wrote the book, I really examined all of the messages on the cards. You'll find, like now, you'll see a code from an email standpoint where somebody will say LOL for laugh out loud. There was actually little codes, that people wrote just to make as much, get as much in the space that they had at that time. So they would use abbreviations or talk about the green when they were talking about money and stuff like that. So they had their own sort of postcard language like you have internet language today.
And Kathy, you're a collector. Did you get started reading John's book on Maplewood? How did you get started doing postcards?
Actually, it was previous to that. It was an interest in Maplewood, and when eBay became a thing, I typed in Maplewood, and what I saw that appealed to me was the postcards. And over, I guess now 5 years, I've been collecting and have about 60 postcards of Maplewood.
Terrific.
In fact, John and I, before we knew one another, used to bid against one another.
Kathy always won.
Well, I don't know. You've got some, I don't have some of those.
Now we're talking about postcards. Let's see some postcards. You have a couple here, Kathy, that are pretty terrific. Let's take the big ones first.
This is
There you go.
Baker Street.
Get this out of the way a little bit.
Back in the very early 1900s.
Right.
And the Duran Hedden House, John presented a session up there on our postcards, and they were kind enough to enlarge this. So it's from this postcard. It's the market. There's a fruit market, and then the writer of the postcard put in P.O. because the post office was also in the same building.
Wow.
Back, you see dirt roads, the horse-drawn carriage. This is the railroad station.
Oh, yes,
over
yes,
here.
yes, yes. That's
And you
changed a
see
lot
the
in
train,
time, hasn't
yes.
it?
So, I mean, we see so much here. There was a pharmacy, and this is on this right off Maplewood Avenue, going west on Baker Street.
So those are big postcards, and they had big mailboxes around the 1900s, didn't they? And then we have the train station, which is a terrific. Still looks exactly the same today. Very few changes.
Actually, with its renovations, it has held its classic look.
Wow.
And I believe there's.
That's an old. See that horse and buggy? That's still there, waiting for the train. It's incredible.
It was the jitney 100 years ago.
Wow. And there's Seth Boyden Avenue here in Maplewood, and Seth Boyden had a lot to do with trains, didn't they? He was an inventor of
steam.
steam locomotives and other things. John, did Seth Boyden do?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's one of the interesting things about Maplewood. I mean, you know, when you look in the 1800s, early 1900s, there were so many amazingly talented people. You know, Boyden with the education and the steam engines. It's just an amazing place.
And I think you have some other pictures of trains. In fact, something interesting called Model Park.
Yeah, if we could find it here.
It's somewhere around there.
There you go.
It's
this
Model
is,
Park.
It's actually a card of a section of Maplewood off Ridgewood Road towards the Millburn border that was called, Model Park. And
Was that a Fisher-Price Park? I mean, Model Park? Put it together?
And this card is actually from 1909, and it was a series of 5 cards that we used to advertise this particular development for potential new homeowners. And you see the train there, which is a little out of context from where Model Park actually was, but it was to advertise the fact that you had easy access to the train. But it was actually used for marketing purposes.
Wow. Do you, John, in your collection have a favorite postcard? So I know you have have hundreds and hundreds of postcards.
I love postcards when they have a lot of activity in them. You know, if you look at the model postcard, you can see the conductor walking in the foreground there. There's a card I have of Hickory Street, and it's just a front lawn on Hickory Street from, I think, 1908 or 1909. And there's 4 kids that are sitting on the lawn just playing. You know, 3 girls in their dresses and a boy in his coveralls. And you could take that picture and bring it forward 100 years, and you'd see the same scene. So it's those cards with this activity, with this people, and it helps me imagine what it was like, and was it really as different as we see Maplewood in the world today.
That's pretty much about 22,000 people. Back then it was about 21,000 people. It hasn't changed too much, Maplewood, as far as population.
Not significantly since the 20s.
Since the 20s.
Now I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Kathy. How did you get started collecting postcards?
Yeah, it was Liberty State Park about 15 years ago. My wife and my 2 oldest kids at the time, were just at an antique type show on a nice spring day. And a guy had boxes of postcards, and I didn't even know people collected postcards back then. And they were by town, and I started going through it. We lived in Maplewood at the time, and I found 20 postcards on Maplewood, and I just couldn't believe that there would be 20 postcards on Maplewood. And I suspect there's actually probably 250 that feature Maplewood.
Wow.
But for me, it just touched, you know, I've always had an interest in looking into the past and trying to understand what the life was like at that time. So it just struck that nerve.
So Maplewood was responsible actually for your collecting of postcards.
You
were living in Maplewood?
The town. I live in Maplewood. I've been here 20 years.
Wow. Let's see some of the cards. You have some great cards of some of the streets and houses. And
this one I showed earlier. This is actually Pearson's Pond, which was in the rear of what we know as Pearson's Mill today.
Is that the golf course now where the pond used to be?
That's where the pond is, exactly. And that was drained, I think, in the 19-teens, 1920s, and was drained out. And Pearson had changed the route of a river back there in the 1860s in order to produce power for his mill.
Wow.
For Pearson's Mill. So that was
incredible.
That one. This is a typical street scene in Maplewood. This is North Terrace.
Wow.
And in the distance, you can actually see the high school, way in the distance, but you can see Dirt Road. The houses, if you would have walked down this street today, they might be a different color, but the houses are basically the same.
We got to do a commercial, and we're going to be right back. So, as they say in TV land, don't touch that dial.
Don't think that I brag, I speak of a drag. Why should I learn how to speak Latin and Greek?
It is about balancing our choices between the gray of the concrete jungle and the stunning beauty of the real one. Between a stoic facade of granite and the fury of the canyon. Between deafness and the presence of breathtaking music. Between blindness and blinding beauty. It's why there's EarthShare, the simple way to find balance. EarthShare is the workplace giving program bringing the leading environmental groups under one umbrella. Support Earthshare. Support them all. Earthshare. Please ask your employer about workplace giving. To learn more, please visit our website.
You'll love it and how you love it. Here is the drag. See how it goes down on the heels. Up on.
And welcome back to Nostalgia Alley. I hope during the commercial you wrote a few postcards and sent them to some friends. Kathy has a wonderful postcard of what Main Street in Maplewood looked like around the early 1900s, I guess, Kathy, right?
Yes.
You tell by the old cars.
You can.
It's called,
Actually, it's Maplewood Avenue in the village from two different directions. And you can see the stores may be occupied by different businesses now, but they're still there. There are some apartments above now. This is the corner of Maplewood Avenue and Highland, where the former cornucopia was.
Right. I
building.
recognize that.
Yeah. And then this
We have
one
more up to
is,
date.
you can tell from the cars
Yeah.
again. We've moved up to the 50s, and it is
I can see. Well, a lot of it's still there,
Yeah.
you know, which is amazing part of Maplewood. Most of the structures still remain. So you can walk down Maplewood. It's like being there in the turn of the century. This I love, the post office. That's when you could
Yes.
mail a postcard for 1 cent.
Yes. This was, I guess, the second post office, being as the first had been inside the fruit market. This one was on Maplewood Avenue, also on the east
Right.
side, and it also was the home for the home news, the Maplewood newspaper.
Right. And you have a picture of the school, too, the Maplewood School. And according to my notes, the tuition in 1817 was $1.75 per quarter. A little bit more. Was it up to $1.90 now?
Well, there is a story where the schoolmaster needed to collect the money from the students. So he was collecting his own salary. He was cleaning, and he was keeping the fires going. So
I love that, keeping the fires going.
This is the first card that I've seen, and it is before 1906 because
Right.
it is not divided. It is the public school of Maplewood, which when added on to became Rickleton Junior High School and then Maplewood Middle School.
Great. Now, the question I'm going to ask both of you, and if your spouses are listening, you might be in trouble on this, but Kathy, what's the most you ever paid for a postcard?
$50.
And what made it so special?
Well, it was one that I had not seen before. It was the first one that I had shown you on Baker Street, and it held so much for me with the train station, with the two businesses and the post office, the horse, the dirt road. I mean, and knowing that I walk by there a couple of times a week, it was just very nostalgic for me.
John, what's the most you ever paid?
It was $28, and it was the Hickory Road card I mentioned earlier with the kids on the front lawn, which I suspected there probably hadn't been too many produced because it was so personalized, but that was it.
What I like about the hobby of postcards, it's affordable. It's not where you have to lay out hundreds and hundreds of dollars for a Van Brickle vase or a piece of furniture or for a model train. These things are generally, you know, if you shop $5, $6, $7 a postcard. And for that price, you can own a piece of history. It's wonderful to hold it in your hands and see the writing of days gone by. It must be a thrilling thing.
It is.
It really must be.
And I think there's a lot of sources for postcards too. You know, you mentioned that you went online to get yours, and Kathy and I have both bought postcards through eBay, which has gotten very expensive. You know, it's made it
Has
readily
it?
available, but it's
Yes.
opened the market up to a lot of people. But if you look, you know, in any antique news type publications, you can find postcard shows where you could go through shoe boxes and shoe boxes of postcards that are usually categorized pretty well by town or topic, and find cards from, you know, like Lamb's Cottages or from places you grew up, maybe in Brooklyn or whatever. But there's just so many cards out there.
Now, the big question is there a holy grail of postcards? What's the most expensive postcard ever bought in the history of postcards?
No.
Is there something you guys look for and say, oh my God, it would be equivalent to, like, say, the Gutenberg Bible? Is there a certain postcard that...
See, I don't think so. I think the value is in the eye of the beholder. And I think with postcards, as Kathy mentioned, that she walks by this place every day, that she has a postcard with his horse carriages, and that's important to her. And for me, having 4 kids, it was seeing kids sitting on a front lawn in Maplewood and realizing it's not so different today. So I think it's really, it's what you think of the card and what you're willing to pay for it. That's the most important thing.
Now, another thing, Kathy's bought some memorabilia. I love this. This is the Maplewood. This is when Jerry comes home after a hard day of work, you take out the Maplewood cookbook.
Well, this, again, was eBay, and it's a 1940 publication from the Women's Auxiliary of Morrow Methodist Church, 1940, and Joan and I were looking at it last night, and it's
Were you
all
swapping recipes?
handwritten here.
Wow, handwritten. I love
Handwritten recipes. Some of them are marked good. I haven't tried any
Not
yet.
so good and not good. And another thing which I love is the Maplewood Theater in town. We have a theater actual schedule of all the different things. This Love of Theirs, The Miracle of Morgan's Creek. And I think years ago they gave this out as you entered the theater. And I think this is actually the introduction to the new Maplewood Theater when new owners took over. It was originally a vaudeville house, I believe, many, many years ago, and some top people played there. But what I love are the prices. I mean, depending on when you go, adults 35 cents, children 25 cents. If you go out on a Saturday evening, it's 50 cents, but your children are still a quarter. Sunday matinee, 44 cents. I mean, those were the days when people say, oh, isn't it wonderful? Those are the days you could go to a movie for 50 cents. But they didn't tell you your salary was like $21 a week. Right. So proportionally, it's not, it's not so great. But, and then other things that you have here too. Murals of Maplewood. This is wonderful. All the different murals.
This is from the murals in Town Hall. It's the original Historic Murals book. And we have since, in restoring the murals, published it again. And it is available now.
Were there different artists who did the murals in Maplewood?
No.
Or one artist, basically?
Yeah, one artist did all the murals. And there's the mayor of Maplewood gives an introduction to the murals twice a year. For the people that have just moved into town, they can come and gather.
Wow.
And I strongly recommend, it's just beautiful artwork, but if anybody's interested in learning more about the history, the rich history of Maplewood, the murals categorize or capture different time frames.
James Rickleton.
Right.
James Rickleton.
Yeah, the first schoolmaster. And he would travel, bring all his travels back, and that would be his school lessons for the year.
Wow. Are more and more people getting into postcard collecting? I mean, is there an increase in collectors? Or is it about the same?
I would say that it's probably an increase simply because they're more readily available and the prices have gone up. I mentioned 15 years ago, you could pretty much get any postcard for $1, $2,
Really?
$3. And if you get a nice postcard, Kathy was mentioning one that you paid $9.95 for that nobody bid on. That was a $10 postcard that nobody bid on. Back, 15 years ago, that probably would have been $1 or $2. So I would guess as they've, become more accessible through eBay, and I think as people may be looking back more into the past, that there probably are more people looking at them.
You can get them, I found, in antique bookstores. If you travel out into the country, I found them for 50 cents, $1.
And this is something, I was going to go over here. This, Kathy, is a part of Maplewood, which is kind of neat. And the houses are still there, I understand.
Yes, they are. This is the Quarter Farmhouse and the Spring House. This is Tuscan Road, looking up toward First Mountain, back very long time ago, 1700s.
And originally, Maplewood was orchards, right? Different peach orchards, and we have something here that we can show. Okay, it was a bird's eye view of Maplewood. I'm gonna, there. Thanks, John.
1910.
1910. It's my birthday, 1910. That's great. And it shows some of the
Valley
orchards.
Street going through.
Wow. Fabulous. Do you have some more postcards we can show our viewers out there that we haven't showed? What do we have?
We have some over there, and I know John has
John, you have a
we-
couple
we
extra.
were talking
Yeah.
about this one a little earlier. It's
Yeah.
a sepia tone card that you might know as the Bergdorf Cultural Center. But if you look at this card, which is probably from 1908, 1909, you'll see it's the First Church of Christ Scientist, which is what the building originally was. And you also notice to the right of the building, that was the main hall, is not there. So that was clearly an add-on. So you can also see how some of the architecture and some of the renovations changed the view of Maplewood over time. But again, it was originally a church, much smaller than it is today, and now it's the great Bergdorf Cultural Center.
And basically, most of Maplewood built in the 1920s, which I find interesting. Our house is like 1929, and I found a lot of it was built in the late 20s, which is interesting because that was the height of the Depression. People, didn't have money, yet so much of Maplewood was built at that time. Is there any reason or any explanation for that?
No, I'm not sure from an economic standpoint,
Right.
but I think clearly, a lot of the homes were 1890, 1900 up to 1920. But I think in the 20s, then you had people branching out and expanding, and you had train service, and you had it as an easy commute into Newark, as an example, where businesses were popping up, and you had industry moving into and expanding. I think that probably had as much to do with it as anything.
It was actually the bedroom community of Newark. And how did it get the name Maplewood? How did that come about? I've heard many, many, many stories on it.
Kathy, that one's yours.
Well, the legend,
The legend is
that the train stop had a maple tree at the train station, and it became known as Maplewood after being Jefferson Village, which was part of Springfield.
right.
The Hilton section was Middleville and North Farms. The section around the Clinton School was Newark Heights and Clintonville. So there's different areas within Maplewood were actually had different names. So they all came together and with South Orange and then separated.
You know something? When I take that train, I still look for that tree. I go, where is that maple tree? How did it come about?
There's actually a postcard of the first train station that the Historical Society did a series of cards, included that, and it's probably the size of an outhouse. I mean, they sold
Wow.
tickets and not much else there.
Boy, I love trains. Believe it or not, we're actually running out of time. We have about 20 seconds. I want to thank you for coming on the big color cast here of Nostalgia Alley. And let me hold the book up again. John, where is the book? Let's hold that up. This is a wonderful book. I mean, everything we talked about and much, much more. The Postcard History Series, Maplewood, by John Harvey. It's available locally, and it's pages and pages and pages of fabulous, fabulous, fabulous old homes, things you see now, things you wonder, what was it, that space at one time? So run down and get it.
And if you want an autograph copy, you can come into Freeman's. Fish
Okay,
Market.
come into Freeman's and for an autographed copy and pick up a pound of fish. Anyway, this is Mike Sobel saying thanks for stopping by. It was a great segment. Thank you so much for
Thank
coming
you,
down
Mike.
to the studio.
Thank you.
And this is Mike Sobel saying good night to you, and especially to you.
Right now, you'll love it, and how you'll love it. Here is the drag. See how it goes. Down on the heels, up on the toes. That's a way to do the varsity drag. Do-do-do-do, harder than hot, newer than new, meaner than mean, bluer than blue. Gets as much applause as waving a flag. You can pass many a class, whether you're dumb or wise, if you all answer the call when your professor cries. Everybody down on the heels, up on the toes, stay after school and learn how it goes. Everybody do the varsity drag.